So, hello everyone. We will just wait a few more minutes until everyone is here. People are still coming on Zoom or joining us on YouTube. So please give us another one and a half minutes until we get started. Okay, shall we get started here? Is that okay? Yeah, okay. Good. Okay, so welcome everyone. On behalf of Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and White Plus, I would like to welcome you to this webinar on joint strategies of LGBTQIA+ rights and feminism. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you are based at the moment. And a special warm welcome to our speakers of this webinar. The Friedrich Ebert Stiftung is the oldest political foundation in Germany, linking its work to the core ideas and values of social democracy, freedom, justice, and solidarity. As a non-profit institution, FES works autonomously and independently. White Plus is a European feminist network of women's rights advocates, gender specialists, women's rights organizations, and development NGOs. It focuses currently on migrant women's rights, intersectional feminist movement building, gender-just trade policies, and feminist economic issues, such as digital economy. I'm Julia Günther, and I will be moderating this session. I'm a sociologist and therapist based in Austria, and I'm a member of White Plus and White Austria. Before I start introducing the topic and the speakers of this webinar, I would like to briefly mention some practicalities. You will see in the panel below on your screen, there is an icon of a word globe. If you click on this, you can choose for the interpretation into Spanish and French, and you can mute the original audio. We will have one speaker, Emilia, who will speak in Spanish. So if you need translation into English or French, please do so. For this webinar, we have 1.5 hours. After our speakers' contributions, there will be time to answer questions from the audience. If you want to ask a question or a comment, you can use the chat section at the bottom of your panel. You can also use that if you would like to share your work pertaining this webinar. In the hope that we have enough time for all questions, we will also facilitate live contributions from the audience. If you want to take the floor and ask your question through audio and or video, kindly indicate this in your question or comment in the chat. We will live stream this webinar on YouTube as well. And we will make this webinar available afterwards. If you want to remain anonymous while asking questions or while you comment, we suggest you to please rename yourself with anonymous or any other pseudonym that you would prefer. We are committed to a feminist exchange and interaction. As organizers, we reserve our right to exclude anyone who uses offensive or discriminatory language or who abuses this space in an undemocratic way. So please be aware of that. This webinar aims to provide insights on how to integrate an intersectional lens on feminist activism and policy around gender mainstream. It is part of a series of 4 web seminars and materials to be provided. There's one more upcoming webinar in January. The date, as I've understood, is not set yet, but it will be towards the end of January, and it is on intersectional gender mainstreaming in policy making, so more on the focus of this whole webinar series. The link will be provided in the chat. Intersectional feminism helps us to act on patterns of gender discrimination in which multiple layers of power inequalities tied to other aspects of people's identities, such as age, gendered expression, color of skin, sexual orientation, and location, are continuously reproducing multiple discriminations. To come to our specific webinar, we see that the ultra-conservative political groups connect the backlash on women's rights with an attack on the rights of LGBTQIA+ communities, among several other intersections. It opens up strategic questions on how LGBTQIA movements and feminists can and should work together in the future, which is what we want to address today. To help us to do so, I'm delighted that we have 3 esteemed speakers among us today who will share their insights and thoughts with us. Dana Ash is joining us from Lebanon. She is a cultural and social activist, writer, and the founder and executive director of Haven of Arts, a non-profit feminist art organization based in Beirut, Lebanon, that works at the intersection of art and activism, unapologetically campaigning and advocating for women's and queer rights. She was named one of the BBC's 100 most inspirational women for 2019, the 2020 Woman of Distinction Award from the NGO Committee on the Status of Women, and the 2021 Leader in LGBT Health Equity Award from the Lebanese Medical Association for Sexual Health for Advancing LGBTQ Wellbeing in Lebanon. Welcome, Dana. Victor Dinarski lives in New York City and works as a philanthropic professional concerned primarily with the issues of public health, human rights of marginalized communities, and counteracting disinformation. Victor is a member of Grantmakers United for Trans Communities, an initiative of funders for LGBTQ issues, which aims to inspire a philanthropic culture that is inclusive and supportive of trans people through grant and decision-making. They are also active with the Global Philanthropy Project, serving as the co-chair of its trans and intersex funding working group. Welcome, Victor. Emilia Marquez Pisano is an anthropologist, author, and activist in feminist and LGBTQIA+ communities in Colombia. She is on the board of directors, being the director in the area of gender and sexuality for the NGO Templores in Colombia. Templores has played a vital role in documenting police brutality in Colombia, especially within the context of social protests this year. The association also organizes participatory research and advocacy projects that advocate for the realization of the rights of people with non-normative sexualities and genders in Colombia, with the current focus on access to healthcare. Welcome, Emilia. So, Emilia, I'm going to start with you, that you can start us off with the context from which you are sharing your perspective today. Maybe you can give us a brief insight into your work. Thank you. So to all of you, please switch to the interpreters in case you need interpretation for Emilia's input. Thank you.
Bueno, gracias Julia, y gracias por esta invitación a FESWIDE, a White Plus y Feminismos. Bueno, yo les voy a hablar un poco desde el contexto de Colombia y espero estar hablando lo suficientemente rápido para que la interpretación alcance a ser transmitida. Bueno, desde el contexto de Colombia hemos visto que aunque ha habido avances, sobre todo en términos de derechos, sobre todo en términos del litigio estratégico que han hecho los activismos feministas y LGBT o de disidencias de género y sexualidad en el país, también aún existen situaciones de violencia y vulneración de derechos humanos. Y en los últimos años, como en esta ola creciente que también ha habido en otras partes de Latinoamérica y del mundo, hemos visto el movimiento antiderechos utilizando conceptos como el de ideología de género como herramienta política, no solamente para bloquear los derechos de mujeres y personas LGBT y otros cuerpos feminizados, sino también para bloquear otros procesos de acceso a derechos en el país, como por ejemplo el proceso de paz que tuvimos en el 2016 y que ahorita cumple 5 años. En este momento puedo dar dos ejemplos de cómo los derechos siguen siendo vulnerados y cómo seguimos viendo situaciones de violencia. Por ejemplo, en nuestro informe que marcada con nuestros derechos, que salió en el 2019, pudimos ver cómo en los últimos 10 años, incluso después de que se aplicara la política pública LGBT en Bogotá, lo que hemos visto es una subida de los casos de violencia que registra el Estado en contra de esta población. Si bien esto se puede deber, aunque antes no teníamos las herramientas para registrar, también tiene que ver con que en todo caso, la violencia no ha bajado, es decir, las estrategias que estamos usando solamente de, por ejemplo, tener una política pública identitaria, no están funcionando realmente para reducir los índices de violencia que sufrimos en el espacio público. Entre estos índices de violencia que sufrimos, dos de los actores institucionales o estatales más repetidos son la policía y los espacios de prestación o las personas que prestan servicios de salud. De esto les voy a profundizar un poco más tarde. En términos de, digamos, este backlash antiderechos que estamos viviendo en este momento, también podemos ver cómo, por ejemplo, en este momento que la Corte Constitucional colombiana está discutiendo la eliminación del delito del aborto de nuestro Código Penal, que en este momento se considera un delito y por el que son judicializadas alrededor de 400 personas, según el movimiento Causa Justa colombiano. Están igual entonces los movimientos antiderechos intentando frenar esta discusión, tanto que lo han logrado y una decisión que íbamos a ver reflejada de la Corte Constitucional en este mes de noviembre ha sido aplazada hasta enero por el bloqueo, digamos, de estas estrategias antiderechos a uno de los magistrados de la Corte Constitucional que sabían que daría una decisión favorable ante este tema para el feminismo. Entonces estamos viendo este tipo de situaciones en donde sí que ha habido un intento de los activismos de tener litigio y de tener, digamos, un colchón de derechos muchísimo más robusto para los cuerpos feminizados de mujeres y los cuerpos disidentes del género y la sexualidad, pero digamos, vemos que hay una estrategia también muy fuerte para contraponerse a esto y sí que hay también una cultura muy machista y patriarcal que atraviesa no solamente a la ciudadanía, sino el fondo de nuestro Estado, ¿no? Y esto es algo que, como creo que hablaremos más tarde, pues es algo que igual es un constante de lo que atraviesa las lógicas de los estados-nación. Entonces, un poquito para darles más contexto, también vemos que hemos tenido últimamente una ruptura creciente entre algunos sectores feministas y LGBTI. que aunque podrían estar aprendiendo y apoyándose mutuamente, porque además, digamos, lo que nos muestran las investigaciones que hemos hecho en temblores es que precisamente son los cuerpos feminizados, es decir, los cuerpos que son castigados por un sistema, digamos, cis heteropatriarcal que castiga, domina y oprime a ciertos cuerpos. Digamos, ahí nos encontramos en este cuerpo feminizado, pero estamos viendo que hay cada vez más como una pequeña o en algunos casos una gran ruptura entre movimientos feministas y LGBT. De nuevo, el acuerdo de paz, por ejemplo, nos muestra cómo cuando empieza a haber esta discurso de la ideología de género, de el acuerdo de paz nos va a llevar a una ideología de género en el país, para convencer a la ciudadanía de que votara por no hacer un acuerdo de paz. Eh, Vemos que hay una ruptura y algunos sectores feministas dicen como no, tenemos que luchar por proteger a las mujeres y no por proteger los derechos de las personas LGBT, porque esto es precisamente lo que se considera ideología de género, ¿no? Vemos que, digamos, tenemos una concepción de que ampliamente o socialmente, digamos, más ampliamente, está más aceptado proteger a las mujeres, ¿no? Porque incluso la protección de las mujeres se puede dar desde un lugar patriarcal, que proteger los derechos de las disidencias de género y sexualidad. Entonces ahí tenemos pues un primer momento en donde vemos esta ruptura y es una ruptura que se ha ido acrecentando, por ejemplo, con los feminismos transexcluyentes y con también algunas partes del movimiento LGBT que no se toman lo suficientemente en serio la necesidad de trabajar también por los derechos de las mujeres y de los cuerpos feminizados, ¿no? Entonces acá tenemos como este panorama, digamos, de Colombia. Yo creo, y desde Temblores hemos visto que no podemos trabajar estos temas separados y por eso nuestra área se llama de género y sexualidad e incluye, digamos, todo esto en un conjunto, porque pues si pensamos que el sistema estructural que tenemos que cambiar es el mismo para los dos casos, ¿no? Eh, en ejemplos del trabajo de Temblores, entonces, también hemos visto, y esto ya desde la organización, que desde el año pasado la pandemia nos generó mayores políticas de control de los cuerpos al interior del Estado colombiano. Por ejemplo, se le dio mucho más poder a la policía, es decir, la policía terminó siendo casi que el agente que controlaba quién podía salir a la calle. En Bogotá específicamente controlaban si hombres o mujeres podían salir a la calle durante un momento, con la política del pico y género, en donde solo hombres podían salir un día y solo mujeres podían salir un día. Evidentemente esto generó pues una situación de inseguridad casi que total para las personas trans. Em, entonces a la policía se le dio más poder, esto resultó en unas tensiones, creo que históricamente muy nuevas o no muy nuevas, pero que recientemente no habíamos visto en tal magnitud entre la policía y la ciudadanía. Y esto para las personas feminizadas y mujeres se vio desde violencia de género acrecentada y violencia sexual muy acrecentada por parte de la policía. En términos del sistema de salud, que es el otro ejemplo que voy a tomar para hablarles de esto ahorita, vimos que, digamos que con estas políticas que también se volvieron de mayor control de los espacios de salud, de mayor control de qué cuerpos pueden estar, de no podemos tener los espacios llenos porque no podemos tener, digamos, un esparcimiento del COVID. Lo que vimos fue también entonces mayor barrera de acceso a la salud para cuerpos LGBT que ya teníamos barreras de acceso a la salud antes, ¿no? Entonces ahora vemos cómo el COVID se puede utilizar también como esta herramienta de barrera de derechos, en donde se le trae a las personas como una justificación muy fácil de, no, es que usted no puede entrar a este espacio porque tal cosa, ¿no? Eh, y digo entrar a este espacio porque es que desde qué maricada con nuestros derechos, pero también desde el informe que sacamos este año, sin curas ni remedios, hemos visto que las barreras de acceso a la salud para esta población empiezan a veces con que literalmente no se les deja entrar al espacio de prestación de salud por la manera en la que se expresa su género o por la manera en la que, digamos, su cuerpo se expresa de alguna manera, ¿no? Esto también pasa sobre todo cuando, por ejemplo, una persona es una mujer trans que ejerce el trabajo sexual. Eh, entonces ahí vemos, pues digamos, este es uno de los temas en los que hemos estado trabajando desde Temblores. Y en el acceso a la salud, pues nosotros en Sin Curas ni Remedios vimos que existe un ciclo de inaccesibilidad al derecho a la salud, en donde más del 44% de las personas que encuestamos para nuestro informe han sufrido situaciones de violencia y discriminación. Estas son todas personas LGBT y algunas de ellas, una parte grande de ellas ejerce el trabajo sexual. Vemos que, digamos, esto de nuevo especialmente se acrecenta para las mujeres y otros cuerpos feminizados que están en la categoría. Vemos que entonces este momento en donde las personas han vivido situaciones de violencia y discriminación o conocen a alguien que ha vivido estas situaciones en el acceso a la salud, llevan a que el 79% de quienes contestaron consideraran que era difícil encontrar espacios seguros en el acceso a la salud, es decir, las personas se sienten tremendamente inseguras y esto genera a su vez que el 50% de las personas hubieran evitado en algún momento atender un problema de salud por el miedo o por la pereza a veces de asistir a un lugar en donde van a ser eh, discriminadas o violentadas. Entonces, pues lo que tenemos es un problema de salud pública en donde hay una desconfianza enorme sobre el sistema de salud y esto pues lo que genera es una inaccesibilidad generalizada a este derecho fundamental y este derecho humano que es el acceso a la salud. Ya en nuestro informe que marcaba con nuestros derechos habíamos hablado de cómo hay una cadena de discriminación que resulta en que las instituciones que deberían cuidar a estos cuerpos feminizados de mujeres y disidentes de las normas de género y sexualidad no solo son a veces negligentes, sino que a su vez generan más violencias sobre estas personas. Este es el caso de la policía, de nuevo, y de quienes prestan servicios de salud. En nuestro informe que marcaba con nuestros derechos vimos que estadísticamente estos son los cuerpos o son sí, los cuerpos estatales que son más violentos en contra de estos cuerpos feminizados y disidentes. Y ahí vemos que, digamos, yo creo que esto no es una coincidencia. De nuevo, esto tiene que ver con un orden, son claramente dos órganos o dos instituciones que tienen que ver con el orden deseado de los cuerpos, que tienen que ver con una normalidad deseada y con crear esos órdenes y esas normalidades deseadas. Entonces, tenemos la policía, por un lado, pues que literalmente tiene en su misión mantener el orden ciudadano, ¿cierto? La policía, pues hasta hace muy poco tiempo tuvo en Colombia digamos, funciones explícitas en contra de los cuerpos homosexuales, en donde también se incluía los cuerpos trans, ¿cierto? Tenía la posibilidad de detener a estos cuerpos en la calle porque su presencia era ilegal. Y luego tenemos un cuerpo médico que ha ordenado desde siempre que es normal, incluso hasta el punto de decir, ¿usted cuánto mide? ¿Usted mide 1,55? No, es que lo normal es que usted mida 1,70 centímetros, ¿cierto? Entonces le vamos a dar una hormona para que usted crezca, ¿no? Este es un ejemplo, digamos, de cómo la medicina pues genera una normativa total sobre los cuerpos y evidentemente en términos de género y sexualidad, pues esto se acrecenta incluso hasta que pues en la OMS teníamos como enfermedades la homosexualidad y el transgenerismo hasta hace muy poco, ¿no? Entonces, no es una casualidad que estos dos, digamos, órganos se vuelvan, digamos, los unos de los que más violentan a estos cuerpos en nuestro estado. Y yo creo que ya para ir cerrando, estos cuerpos institucionales y esta violencia que ejercen estos cuerpos institucionales realmente nos muestra algo que entonces se esconde detrás, ¿no? Son una cara de un Estado que es un Estado pues que está, digamos, regido también por unos órdenes patriarcales, por unos órdenes masculinizados y por unos órdenes claramente cisgénero y heterosexuales. Entonces, un poco creo que estos
Emilia,
dos
may
nos
I
están
ask you to wrap
hablando.
it up?
Yeah.
Because so that we can get into the other discussion.
Yeah, this was the last. Entonces, sí, finalmente, pues estos son, por eso escogí estos dos, porque creo que nos darán unas claves para hablar más adelante.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for providing us with already so many discussion points that we can already address in terms of state violence, police violence, the pandemic, body politics. There's so many things that we can focus on, and also that disruption between feminist movements and LGBTQIA plus movements. And our aim now, after that contextualization that Victor and Dana are also giving us, is to see where we can join forces and have commonalities in strategy. So thank you, Emilia. Victor, may I invite you to give your contextualization?
Thank you. Emilia, thank you so much for this for the Colombian context. I will be speaking about Poland, and I feel that a lot of the things that you have raised connect very well with the Polish context. I think, unfortunately, on the negative side than the positive for now, but I'm hoping that when we talk about common strategies, there will be also things that we can align with. Just for context, I will be speaking about Poland. I live in the US, but I am a Polish immigrant, and I came here a few years ago after working as a trans activist for more than a decade, and I'm still in touch with a lot of my previous colleagues, but also friends from the movements, and we often speak about common strategies that can also help inform philanthropic culture. In my day-to-day work, I work as a grant maker. Or work with other grant makers as well on this context, and I think it's very important to be able to also speak from that perspective. But what I wanted to speak about in terms of Poland, I think it's important to bring the context of Poland as a recently growing authoritarian state. I think it's a as one of the countries of the European Union, it's very similar to Hungary in the way that human rights have been on the decline for the last couple of years. I think in terms of how we would frame this in actual years, I think a good point to start is the 2015 presidential elections and further elections where the currently ruling party, Law and Justice, as it's called in English, has taken over or most majority of the parliament, the Senate, and the presidential seat, and through that has established itself as a sort of moral setter or setter of morals, but also the agenda against marginalized populations. And it's pretty clear that this anti-rights agenda is linked with anti-feminism, particularly anti-feminists who work on reproductive rights issues, especially abortion. In Poland, abortion rights have been on the decline, and recently through a constitutional court ruling has been made almost entirely illegal, which has led to more prominent activism based mostly on mutual aid rather than advocacy to change those regulations. I think it's there's also been an interesting shift in feminist and reproductive rights activism in that case, as before for years it was focused primarily on trying to change abortion laws and supporting people who want to receive abortions in a sort of like small scale. Now the mutual aid aspect, particularly around helping people to get abortions abroad, has really skyrocketed, and we see that this is one of the strategies that's been more prominent in the movements. The anti-rights agenda also includes anti-LGBTQIA and particularly anti-trans aspects. There is there has been a very clear scapegoating campaign against LGBTI people. It really depends from year to year and usually is reactivated very close to the elections. Previously, between 2015 and 2017, the anti-LGBTQIA agenda was very much focused on the entirety of the movement, particularly around sexuality, threat to children, I think very common tropes that we have seen decades ago, but also that are re-emerging. And now, I think between 2018 and 2020, it has focused primarily on trans people, and particularly trans people as danger to Polish culture, to Polish morals, gender transition, or transgressions as a dangerous Western idea that is colonizing Eastern Europe. That's also something that came out of, and I think it's very interesting to see how sometimes close these strategies are to what we hear coming, for example, from Russia in terms of the anti-LGBTQI law that's in place there, the so-called gay propaganda law. Poland doesn't have a anti-gay propaganda law, fortunately, but we see lawmakers every now and then kind of wrestle with the idea, putting a message out there to the media to check what the public thinks about it, just and also not being afraid to share those dangerous ideas. One of the few that we have heard before was there have been ideas for example, outlawing gender transition to make it impossible, exactly as it has happened in Hungary. So there are a lot of influences coming from that particular part of the EU, but also from Russia and from other Western concepts. I think many of us have read, there was a report by Open Democracy about how, for example, Christian evangelicals from the US are importing hate, particularly homophobia and transphobia, to various locations. And we see some of that also in Poland coming in. There is also disinformation. Disinformation is linked to the anti-rights and LGBTQIA agenda. Disinformation concerns abortion. It's not primarily coming from the state, but it is coming from actors who are very close to important state figures. So we have a disinformation campaign around vaccinations at the moment. This campaign has been there before COVID-19, but has become more prominent as we see across the world as well. So it has taken up disinformation, obviously, around trans people, around abortion, around women's rights, around who supports women's rights. And there is also the category of scapegoating that I have mentioned that has been particularly linked to the elections. And I think another thing that I wanted to mention very quickly is that there are, in terms of marginalizations and scapegoating, aside from targeting whole populations, which is an important strategy in the Polish context, because there have been also rulings of various courts that deem that even though hate speech is outlawed on the constitutional level, it very often does not apply to groups such as LGBTQIA people. So anti-rights activists usually speak of a group because it's very hard to persecute that kind of speech or even work against it in a legal manner. So I think what we have seen because of that is the rise of narrative change work and media work that helps counteract the disinformation and speech that borders on hate speech. And the last thing I'm going to say is that aside from this, there also have been examples of individuals being particularly prosecuted in as political dissidents or as political activists. Last year, through um, last year, the police arrested one of the prominent non-binary activists in Poland, Margoszutowicz, who was just one of the many people who have been leading and being in anti-government protests. But for some reason, she was brought as an example that needed to be shown. So she got arrested. There was a lot of media work around this, portraying her as a violent aggressor, and many liberal media also jumped on this, which I think is an important question around how liberal media or liberal actors feed into the anti-rights agenda. And aside from Margot was fortunately released, and now she's at home, but she has been kept for months alone, arrested, without any means to fend for herself. And the last thing that has come up for the last couple of weeks, which was shared by the Abortion Dream Team, which is one of the most prominent abortion rights groups that also provides mutual aid, particularly around accessing abortion abroad. One of their members is being currently prosecuted as an accessory to abortion because she has sent abortion pills to someone who required them, and um, they have been seized by the police through the person's boyfriend who decided that he wanted to report this to the police. So I think we're seeing also that individual activists are being taken sort of like out of the group to show that the state has power, and that the state, if it wants to, it will exercise that power even against individuals. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Victor. Okay, so we again have the topic of the state that is using its power to, well, show their power over people who are fighting to have their human rights, to have the full human rights. And you also address the role of the media, and I think that the role of the media can be very dangerous, but we can also look maybe then afterwards, how can we use it to our advantage? And I think it's important to address the difficult relationship that we have with the media. And you, with the examples you have given, you illustrated that really well. Thank you so much. And of course, the difficult situation of trans non-binary people in Poland and the abortion rights in Poland. So thank you, Victor. Dana, may I come to you to give us your contextualization for today? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dana Ash. I'm the Executive Director of Haven for Artists. So I'm going to try to give a broad kind of general understanding of the context in Lebanon. I don't know if many of you know Lebanon or where it's situated or what's been happening, especially in the last 2 years. To give you a brief overview, in October 17, 2019, the October Revolution of Lebanon began. It has been ongoing since then. We've had 3,200% devaluation in local currency. We have had spikes of COVID with the rest of the world, but to be quite honest, COVID is the least of our problems. We have the financial crisis with a 3,200% inflation. We have currently a vacant government, and took us 3 different cabinets of resignations, and still nothing has been done. The currency is in free fall. The country is in free fall. There is no medical support. There are absolutely no medication in Lebanon. They've lifted subsidies on medication that we would import, which makes it practically impossible for people with the 3,200% inflation on local currency to purchase their life-saving chronic medication.
May I ask you to speak a bit slow for the interpreter? It's a bit too fast for them. Okay, thank you so much.
I have a tendency to go on a roll, so I'm going to try to slow down.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so with the 3,200% inflation in local currency, we have lost our capacity to purchase medication. We already had this issue starting from October 2019. We've been having this issue with the Ponzi scheme that the BDL, which is the Banque de Liban, which is the central bank of Lebanon, has been playing with high interest rates on international investors in order to bring dollars into the country. But of course, that bubble burst, just like real estate has burst. This happened, sadly, coinciding with the revolution and with COVID, which has created much higher restraints and basically the best way that the government could react to whether it be COVID or the financial crisis or any of the protests was through violence. So the lockdown itself, it was the military. It was the military on the streets shutting us down. It wasn't cops. It was the military shuffling us into our houses. and they called for a state of emergency after the Beirut blast. I'm trying to focus mostly on the revolution and on COVID, just to give you context that we all kind of have in common. And then I add the cherry on top, which is the third largest non-nuclear explosion in history, which happened on August 4th, 2020. The explosion itself took a diameter of 10 kilometers squared. It destroyed the city of Beirut, which is the capital of Lebanon. It rendered over 300,000 houses destroyed, over 100,000 people homeless. It killed 218 to date, and people are still suffering. We actually just lost a young man, I think a week ago, from the injuries that he sustained in the blast. We've had over 7,000 injuries, including disabilities, amputations, scars that are amenable. People have lost a lot more than just housing, as we like to say. Our livelihoods, being that this hit the center of Beirut, it hit mostly the LGBTQI and women's community, which is where they predominantly live and work. This is the safest area, as we like to call it. I'm just trying to make sure that everyone can hear me, because I believe the screen froze a little bit.
We can hear you fine. There are some interruptions, but
fantastic.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So with the issue with the Beirut blast, first of all, you cannot separate the patriarchy from capitalism. You cannot separate, the colonial imperialist ideology, and the way that it's also, whether we like it, like Victor mentioned, seeps directly into media, because whether we like it or not, media is owned by corporations, and these corporations are owned by politicians, and these very same politicians are the ones that get campaign promises from these media. So this concept of being able to separate media and politics, or media and corporation, is in of itself an obsolete kind of thought process, because it's impossible. So it's basically the working class and all of us that are fighting for rights, and then everyone else that are benefiting from our oppression, whether it's financially, monetarily to speak, or power-wise, and take over more oppressive spaces.
Dana, I'm sorry, the interpreter ask me again, please. Thank you.
No. I'll go slower, because I also think it's cutting a little bit, so they can catch on to things I say as I go along.
Now you muted yourself.
No, I muted myself because I was telling them to check the Wi-Fi. It's cutting.
So okay. All right.
Because it seems to be getting a little slower. But to go back to it, so all of these things are extremely interconnected. And when we're talking in the context of Lebanon, which is, we don't talk about the decision-making of Lebanon as a sovereign state. We're talking about geopolitics. We're talking about the many actors that are involved in the region that directly have an implication into the outcome of, let's say, the new cabinet or the new assembly of cabinet. We also have a lot of issues internally with sectarian strife, being that we have over 18 sects, and therefore we have divided allegiances, so to speak. To jump to the Beirut blast itself and the impact that it had on the LGBTQI community, I'm part of the coalition, which is called the Yalla Care Coalition. We came together after COVID to distribute aid and food to the community throughout Lebanon. But after the Beirut blast, we reassembled, and we've created basically one of the first of its kind assessments and distributions and referral systems in the region. One of the things that we were able to draw out of this assessment, I'm not going to share too much of the data, but just a general understanding of how hard Beirut was hit, and how much the LGBTQI community and women's community that mainly live in Mar Mikhael and in Beirut, which is the most cosmopolitan, most people coming in and out, therefore some of the safest spaces between galleries galleries, community centers, bars, everything basically that was LGBTQI safe, safe to be in, was absolutely destroyed. And not only was it destroyed, the spaces that so most people, you go and you live close to your safe space. You live close to the area that's safest to you. So they lived in that area, so they lost their homes, they lost their safe spaces. And of course, you're gonna work next to your home, so they also lost their venues of employment. I'm just gonna give you a little extract from the Yalla Care report that should be released next week. The Yalla Care report is compiled out of 8 organizations that work on LGBTQI rights, services, and aid. Haven has been taking lead for the past year, working on this assessment. To give you an example, 64% of all trans women living in Lebanon do not feel safe physically in their immediate neighborhood. 74% do not feel safe in their immediate verbal. Just every day they've received some kind of verbal threat, some kind of verbal attack, and we're talking within their street. We're not talking like the general area. We're not talking all of Lebanon. We're talking just the block that they reside. That's 74%. 77% expect sexual and gender-based violence. To give you another thing, 1 in 2 of the persons that we discussed with or asked about gender-based violence or sexual and gender-based violence, 65% said that they have experienced it either directly or indirectly to their everyday life because of their neighborhoods. 41% are subjugated to SGBV. 63% of the trans community has been directly affected by sexual and gender-based violence, whereas 49% of the LGBT community as a whole has been attacked on gender-based violence. These numbers are frightening. The amount, we're talking 42% of LGBTQI community members do not have access to clean water. We're talking 62.8% have no jobs. 71.6% of the trans community does not have a form of employment. And this is not talking about absolutely everything that's melding into this because of the financial crisis. Whether we like it or not, Lebanon has very strict laws about LGBT. How it's worded is quite vague. We have a penal code law called 534, Article 534 of the French Mandate, because we were colonized by France until 1948. So they left us this very beautiful, basically constitution, and all within it is criminalizing all our bodies and directly connected currently now with the civil status laws of women, which means we have none because it's directly connected to whatever religion you're in. So if you are Muslim, you go to the courts of that. If you are Christian, you go to that court. There is no federal court, so to speak. There is, but it's mostly skewed with religious banter. Another thing that right now we're really, I mean, I can give you numbers for hours. It's really bad here. So 534 makes it legal for them to imprison us up to a year. And the vagueness of the law is unnatural or against nature. So basically, it depends on the reflection of the judge at that immediate moment and what their religious understanding is, whatever it is, so that they could kind of take that law and what they think is best. Luckily, in the last 3 to 5 years, we've had a few court cases in which the judge has thrown out the case itself, saying that this is not unnatural, being that it's common. So these are some of the new precedents that are now currently working, but it's not enough on a scale of, because when you get arrested in Lebanon for LGBTQI, you don't get just arrested for 534. They hit you with like 17 different articles, and by the end of it, you can get out of 534 legally, but the other articles is what you go through. So with trans women in particular, they love to focus on sex work as an illegal vocation, and they like put them in jail for that, even if she was not participating in sex work while she was arrested. So they fog it up in so many different directions. They also arrest us for drug use. So if you've ever smoked a joint of hash, you're going to jail. You're going to jail for 3 to 5 years. And they can also, because you might be a trans individual, they will also put sex work in there, which is also illegal here. So by the end of it, you're spending 10 years in jail simply for trying to survive, in a context that is so oppressive and has not allowed you any space to actually reach the comfort that you need, which is just basic rights. The biggest issue that we're now facing is that we live in a very patriarchal government, and whether we like it or not, it's a military state. They're behaving as such. Shadin is a comedian. She's a queer comedian in Lebanon, very, very famous for her outspoken work. She's an incredible activist, and she has just now been summoned to military court. We had another journalist last week that has been sentenced to 1 year and 1 month in jail for, what is the word I believe they said is by disrespecting the honor of the presidency. So this person is about to go to jail for a Facebook tweet. And they've been doing this for a very long time. So they don't focus on things that are actually vicious to our lives. They don't know who destroyed our city. They are the ones who blew it up. And to quote the Haven creative director, she always says, because the explosion happened at the port of Beirut. So she says, this is the portriarchy. And this is exactly what it is, which is inflicting violence on our bodies in any which way manner that they can think of. We also have, on top of that, it is illegal to have abortion in Lebanon. It's also legal up until 1.5 years ago. It's legal for your rapist to marry you, and then they don't go to jail for raping you. This has, thankfully, thanks to incredible feminists and activists, has been changed, but there's still all the weight on the women to prove that they were the ones that were raped. So basically, you have to prove everything. There's also new sexual harassment laws, which also put all the pressure on women to do so. So there's a large integrated.
Dina, may I ask you, so that because our time is sort of running by, may I ask you to, because you're speaking a lot about things that are also connected to feminist movements, and I'm wondering the patriarchy, the state violence. So I'm wondering if we can move to our second set of questions, and if you could already incorporate that into your input. What are the possible strategies? And it sounds like there are certain strategies also already in place of LGBTQIA movements with feminist movements, of how both can work together in order to improve the situation and to implement human rights on a broader scale. So if you could already get to that question during your input, I would be very grateful.
Absolutely. So effective strategies would be, first of all, communication and organizing together. In Lebanon, it's different for us because we are all on the front lines together. So in the revolution, we're physically together on the front lines. We're physically creating these slogans and works, and we're physically being within the same spaces to ensure the safety of one another. I believe it's imperative and practically impossible to be an intersectional feminist and not work for LGBTQI rights. I mean, it seems redundant, and basically there's a gap there, you know. The gap is far too wide to be able to say that there isn't a shared strategy, whether it be in Lebanon with the feminist movement and LGBTQI movement, how we took to the front lines. It wasn't just as a fact of we want to be on the front lines, but our bodies are on the front lines. Our physical, our emotional, our metaphysical bodies, all of these laws that oppress are against our physical bodies. So of course, physically, we manifested to be on the front lines of the revolution. And I think it's extremely imperative to be able to understand that there is no one thing over the other. There's no prioritizing one's rights over another's rights. The moment you do that, you're literally nitpicking who is human and who isn't. And it's kind of like playing on, you know, with the US when they did the laws to want to incorporate different things that made people, you know, equal. They still use terminology to enable the lack of equality, even if the term was, oh, all men are created equal, but here are some sub-little causes to make sure that you don't really think you are. And these are the kind of influences that I think is very important for intersectional feminists and LGBTQI activists to understand, is the iron fist is over all of our houses. And in the words of Audre Lorde, we're not going to use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. And I believe that the LGBTQI and feminist movements of today are an extremely different movements from the third and fourth wave feminists that we've all understood and known. And the approach to how we work together is on the simple basis that we understand human rights is not a divisionary, it's not a priority situation, but it is a right. And therefore, the fight for it is in of itself the main premise of any kind of sit down. And if you remove priority, you automatically can understand that you have more in common than you actually have any difference.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I like coming off of what you said, there are no priorities, and any intersectional feminist needs to incorporate LGBTQIA plus issues and topics and rights. I'm absolutely with you on that one. Emilia, may I come to you in terms of your thoughts of how these two movements, feminist movements and LGBTQIA plus movements, can work together? What are the strategies that we need? And just please a short input. Thank you.
Bueno, gracias a Víctor y Deina, creo que nos han mostrado también cómo esto siempre tiene un enfoque interseccional, ¿no? En donde se cruzan drogas, en donde se cruza trabajo sexual, en donde se cruza situaciones socioeconómicas, sistemas económicos, etcétera. Yo creo que, bueno, como ya decía, yo creo que los dos movimientos, y un poco adheriéndome también a lo que decía Deina, son pues parte, o digamos están oprimidos por el mismo sistema de sexo-género, ¿no? Los sujetos de ambos movimientos. Y aún con las diferencias que hay entre ellos, yo creo que se puede generar una fuerza conjunta y se debe generar una fuerza conjunta para revisar cómo las políticas estatales generan violencia en contra de cuerpos que no se asimilan a los mandatos de este sistema de género. Insistir en un Estado que esté centrado en las éticas del cuidado y no de la seguridad, el orden y la normalización de los cuerpos. Y creo que en este punto, tanto las reformas o las necesidades de reformar la salud como las de reforma a las políticas de seguridad y por tanto la policía son un espacio que nos muestra no solo esta necesidad de pensarnos en nuevos estados y no solamente, digamos, nos abren esta posibilidad, sino que nos muestran cómo ya se ha hecho y creo que nos muestran dos puntos claves en donde cada movimiento puede aprender del otro y en donde ojalá pues se volviera un solo movimiento, ¿no? Por un lado, digamos, movimiento feminista, hemos visto, entre otros de los grandes avances que ha tenido este movimiento en Colombia, muchos avances en términos de exigir condiciones suficientes para el acceso al derecho a la salud, que aunque no siempre se materialicen, ¿no? No siempre digamos esto es lo que sucede en realidad, tenemos todavía mucho espacio entre la ley y lo que la gente hace, pues sí vemos que son, digamos, pautas de cómo pensarse un Estado cuidador, sí vemos que ya hay personas que se han sentado a decir un Estado cuidador puede ser así. En esto, por ejemplo, dos ejemplos rápidos, en el aborto, aunque se siga necesitando la despenalización, pues sí se han logrado exigencias para que el sistema de salud dé la información y disponibilidad necesarias a quienes pueden abortar por alguna de las tres causales, que en Colombia son salud mental, violencia sexual y peligro médico para el feto o la mamá. Pues también vemos esto en los protocolos de atención a violencia sexual que, pues a mi modo de ver, en Colombia son muy robustos. Claro, esto no siempre se materializa de nuevo en la práctica, pero yo sí creo que son espacios en donde podemos aprender de cómo el movimiento feminista sí que se ha imaginado, ¿no? Y cómo pues esta imaginación es algo que nos enseña mucho el movimiento feminista de pensarse mundos posibles y entonces hacer esos mundos posibles. En el caso de la policía y la resistencia a la violencia policial, los movimientos de géneros y sexualidades disidentes, y yo creo que específicamente los movimientos trans en Colombia nos han enseñado cómo hacer una resistencia desde los espacios de cuidado mutuo y desde los espacios, digamos, de comunidad que se cuida entre ella, ¿no? Y incluso yo pienso que aunque las marchas LGBT muchas veces están muy cooptadas por un capitalismo ya pues como exagerado, ¿no? En donde salimos a marchar y nos venden cremas de manos y bloqueadores y yo sí creo que muchas de las marchas trans nos muestran espacios de protesta desde el cuidado, de resistencia, de una crítica muy fuerte y además muy tremendamente interseccional. A esta violencia policial y nos enseñan también cómo estar en el espacio público cuidando de nosotros. Y bueno, pues creo que estas son como para no tomar más tiempo unas de las herramientas y unas de las cosas que además ya están pasando y que creo que podemos aprovechar mucho entre ambos movimientos para aprender el uno del otro.
Thank you, Emilia. The caring state, I do like that word. Victor, may I come to you? What are strategies that can work for both movements?
Thank you. I do also like state of care and politics of care. I think this connects very well with what COVID-19 has shown us in terms of how activists and advocates can come together. And it also translates for me into rethinking philanthropy and the way it supports movements. I think very often we put too much pressure on political change and forget that political change may be very short-sighted or not long-term enough, or even if it's long-term, it means that we have a gap of sometimes 5 to 10 years of people still needing support, people still living their individual lives, as Dana has said, in fear, not being able to feel safe. So that also brings up a lot of things to me, and I would like this to be translated onto a philanthropy of care rather than philanthropy of achievements. But in the Polish example, I'm thinking specifically, like I think politics of care have brought mutual aid that has grown out of the humanitarian crisis that is the COVID-19 pandemic. And not only around healthcare and access to healthcare, closed hospitals. I think for trans people, that's a very important part of this unfortunate state of the globe that we are in right now, where obviously having to prioritize the pandemic means that very often trans people are left without care that is essential and life-saving as well. And I think that comes to for many, many people who require services that otherwise have to be paused because of the pandemic. But I think there is something important in the politics of care that this is acknowledged, and also there could be strategies to mitigate this. For example, community-based services that can provide medication, or community-based clinics. If, for example, you're a cancer patient, you can actually receive chemo, and you don't have to go to a hospital that's overrun by patients who are also fighting their lives because of the disease. But when I'm thinking about strategies of the movement, I'm thinking, for example, I feel like when in the Polish example that translates well into what you, Emilia, and Dana have said before, is that I think on the content, I see a lot of more common ways of addressing bodily autonomy and unnecessary medicalization. I think abortion and reproductive rights, together with trans rights, is a space that all of these come together. Unnecessary pathologization of just healthy expressions of not just bodily diversity, but bodies in general. I think bodies that are gendered as female or gender as non-cis male are often being seen, like their actual functions are seen as pathologized in many ways. And there is something about also because of the care aspect, the emergence of sort of different institutions or different forms of organizing. I've seen in Poland, for example, very interesting shift into collectivism and horizontal structures and organizing, rather than more of a Western concept of an organization as an institution that has, a very strict structure. There's the hierarchy. We have boards, you have working groups, etc. It's more. I think we're seeing more of that, and that to me also showcases that part of imagination that you mentioned, Emilia. That it is possible to imagine a world where we all are equals and we are able to collaborate together, rather than putting ourselves in positions of power that often disrupt the work rather than actually make it happen. And from this, I'm also thinking that in terms of tools, there's narrative change work, visibility work. I think that is very prominent in both movements. There is collaboration on shared projects, including protests. I think because of the pandemic as well, we've also seen how protests can be different, how it can be imaginative, how it can be, even though perpetuated by only a small group, actually brings a message to thousands of people. When they were, I'm thinking specifically about protests happening during the pandemic, where gatherings were impossible, people finding ways to creatively engage in something of a large scale, even though they can't meet in thousands. I think we've seen that too, can be online, but also offline. Small groups meeting in different parts of the city, or small groups meeting in every city to create this kind of pressure. And I also think about direct action, which I think has been very interesting in both Poland and in Poland from the both feminist and LGBTQI movement, and those movements together. One of the most interesting ones was activists putting rainbow flags or rainbow scarves on statues in Warsaw, which has been, it's not illegal to put something on a statue, but people have been prosecuted because the state has been using laws against vandalizing, even though nobody was spray painting. It's just a flag that can be removed anytime, and that has been misused, particularly against advocates. So also showing direct action as a way to make fun of the regime you are battling with, as in putting a flag on a statue and doing a live stream on Instagram while being arrested and screaming, "I only put a piece of cloth on the statue. Why are you arresting me?" For example, to showcase. And I think that's a very, very interesting strategy that borders on the absurd and also showcases how on the other hand how absurd the action is, but also how absurd the reaction to that certain action is, which is a very valid strategy against particularly authoritarian regimes who often at some point parody themselves in the way they in the seriousness that they bring to subjects that are not at all serious. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. I like that all three of you mentioned imagination, something that we need in order to think forward of how joint forces are possible, as well as direct actions, as you've just mentioned, Victor. And there is a question from the audience, and please feel free, whoever wants to answer. The audience member asks, how do you see the possibilities, strategies of this joint force in today's globalized world? What can we do to mobilize the public to speak up, not only for local movements, but also for global solidarity? So whoever wants to address that question, please do so. Dana, please.
So to connect that thought, in particular, first of all, bell hooks, if we were to talk about the ethics of love and how we can approach our work with compassion, is a beautiful way to start with that book. But in regards to this in particular, when it comes to global solidarity, we need to understand that doesn't affect us directly doesn't mean it doesn't affect us. And I say this from the context of Lebanon. Let's say the UK funds the riot police here, and the French are the ones that give us the tear gas, which they don't legally use in France because it's so toxic that they don't use it there. They sell it to us here. This is where the whole global solidarity comes in, because it is not my job to tell you how you are oppressing me with your tax dollars. It is your job to stop using those tax dollars to oppress me. Therefore, it's impossible for me to be to coexist in this world and not think on a global approach, especially when you come from the global south, because we have colonization, we have imperialism, we have capitalism, we are not underdeveloped, we are over extorted, we are very well aware of the situation. So when it comes down to it and how we can start understanding the global impact is directly that. When you connect Palestine to Ferguson, you understand the militarized state, you understand police brutality, and you understand how this is in place to enable the control and power of capitalists and the government as is, which is patriarchal. So the premise of us being able to divorce those is impossible, though. So how can I divorce, as someone living in Lebanon, my rights as a woman and an LGBTQI person, from anyone else living anywhere in the world? Well, we're directly under the same thing, especially when the Zionist entity that is bombing Palestinians is the same that sells these military weapons to other countries that are oppressing elsewhere, and vice versa in the States when they come in and they fund different entities that are oppressing locally. That is their responsibility. So there's no way for us to say, let's make it it's already global. It's just about making people understand that they actually have more power. And our power is really in the fact that we can refrain from paying taxes because we don't want to fund military anymore. We can refrain from paying taxes because we want them to divest from military spending and put it into healthcare and education. And we always played these cards of, well, this is the situation, this is how the world is. Well, we made this world and I can unmake it. And that's exactly what I think the understanding of what globalization is in that approach. How can we ensure that we understand that your dollars are funding my murder? And how is that directly implicated in your life? And how are you complicit in that? Just as persons of color and Black people have said for years, it's not my job to teach you about racism. You are racist. It's your job to undo it. And it's the same thing for all of us, I think.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you so much. Does anyone want to add something to what Dana said? I think it's pretty well said, right? Okay, so there's another question. And it's quite a long question, so I'm just going to read it out to you because I haven't read it. I'm sorry. So, what can we answer when in the debate on the importance of the links between women's and feminist movements and the LGBTQI plus movements, we are often told that LGBTIQ do not necessarily define themselves as feminists, that they are not all by essence feminists. For example, here in France, some lesbians and gays movements have fronted disagreement about the equitable sharing of decisions in movements, for example. So, again, it's what one of you has mentioned before, trying to divide those two movements, our two movements. How are we? Yes, Emilia, please go ahead.
Sí, pues yo pienso que yo creo que esto es verdad y creo que es una, digamos, es una cosa válida para decir y creo que es algo en donde el movimiento LGBT se tiene que revisar y creo que esto tiene que ver con también cómo a veces esta, digamos, tensión entre la política de la identidad, ¿no? Y la política también un poco de la estructura social encuentran una división, ¿no? Y yo pienso que para esto, pues sí que es importante que ambos movimientos se revisen. Por un lado, un movimiento feminista que igualiza todo el movimiento LGBT como si todo fuera lo mismo, ¿no? Y como si no hubiera también algunos reclamos y algunos reclamos muy políticos dentro de partes de este movimiento LGBT, debe revisar lo que conoce sobre los movimientos de disidencias sexuales y del género. Y por otro lado, pues yo sí creo que el movimiento LGBT debe tomar en serio esto porque muchas veces hemos visto que como movimiento identitario se ha visto muy despolitizado frente a cosas como el feminismo, frente a cosas como la igualdad de género dentro del movimiento. Sabemos que, por ejemplo, en muchos casos, esto que se encierra como LGBT realmente son espacios en donde los hombres gays cisgénero tienen muchísimo poder, mientras que las personas trans y lesbianas no tenemos tanto poder y otros cuerpos feminizados no tenemos tanto poder. Entonces yo creo que es, digamos, unir movimientos no significa no ser críticos con las violencias que ambos movimientos llevan en su interior. Y creo que es en esta crítica y es en estas tensiones que siempre van a existir en donde podemos precisamente aprender cada vez más a construir espacios o a construir movimientos que se tomen mucho más en serio la no opresión hacia ningún grupo.
Thank you, Emilia. So learning from each other, but also learning from within the movement of what is going wrong or where hierarchies are in place, old power structures, patriarchal power structures that need to be dismantled. So unite, but still be critical. I think that's quite important. Victor, would you like to add something?
Yes, I think just to add to Emilia's point, I think the important question is also for whom the power serves and who benefits from the structure. And I think in the context of a movement that's organized with, in the case, for example, of registered organizations, I think we do not only need to criticize the power of the movement itself and the power within the organization, but also to be very critical of the mechanisms that influence us in creating certain structures. For example, do I have a board, staff, and volunteers or members because there's a law that requires me to do so. And without having a registered organization, I cannot access certain things because my type of activism requires registration, and not every type of activism does. And I think that's very important to say. For example, if you do direct action, that very often you will get arrested or are penalized, or there's a court case against you. It's actually better to not be in a registered organization because that can lead to this organization being deregistered and various other consequences for other people who have worked with you. But there's also, I think I've mentioned before, the question of philanthropy and its role in this. And I think it's important to underline, because as the philanthropic sector becomes more critical of itself, and I think that's good, I think we also need to acknowledge that in the way we have supported movements throughout the years, we have also encouraged a lot of people to register, because some philanthropic entities do not fund unregistered groups. And I think that is one of the biggest mistakes of philanthropy, to not see unregistered group as valid. I think there's a lot of there will be a lot of pros and cons to doing that. And obviously some of this is about safety. Some philanthropic entities think that if an organization is registered, that is much safer than just working with an unregistered group. But I think there are ways around it and alternatives to this. I think the overall question is about the role in philanthropy, but also how philanthropy is funded and by whom. I think Dana's point about capitalism is very important here. A lot of philanthropy is funded because of capitalist money being put into foundations. And I say this is somebody who works for a foundation, and I think that's important too. And just to say, I think, being critical to the mechanisms that create us, and also in the context of the imagination that we have also mentioned, trying to figure out if we are in organizations or structures where some of that imagination can be put into practice and change things, or if they're not changeable at all. I think that's also something that we need to deal with. But just this context of where does are we creating hierarchies because we think they're important, or are we pushed to creating those hierarchies because otherwise access to certain resources is blocked or more difficult? And I think that's also a question we should be asking ourselves. I think for the global care, one of the things that I'm thinking about is if we need funding for work, how about we think about funding not through institutions? Is there a way for us to create a world where we have enough resources that we can fuel the movements as we want to as individuals, rather than have to rely on more prominent structures and institutions? That's one of the things.
Thank you. That's that is an important point for our imagination to go forward, because it also inherently critiques how fundings are being made and who are running these fundings, etc. Or sorry, who is behind these fundings. So okay, since we only have 12 minutes left, I would like us, and since I don't see any questions from the chat, I would like us to come to wrap it up with sort of a hopeful outlook, as I called it. Namely, what is something that you are hopeful about, or that where you see there's some positivity when we think about joining forces of the LGBTQIA+ movement with the feminist movements, of strategies that you have now shared with us? Where do you have some positive thought or hope in this bleak time that we are in? So whoever wants to go first. It seems like, Dana, you were about to say something, but I'm not sure if I was just... Do you want to go ahead? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. I wanted to just add to what I said, what Victor said in regards to hierarchies and understanding that we can reimagine how these structures can, and who are they aiming to serve, because most of the hierarchical kind of structures were meant to serve the top, never the bottom. Part of the things that we do is we have our policies and procedures in our organization. And part of it is that we had the whole team come in, and it was all of our volunteers and teams, and everyone talked about their ideal policy, like what would they need in order to feel safe and seen by the organization. And although in Lebanon, all of the things that are within our policies are technically illegal, we still make sure to have them in our policies as a reflection of our team and as a safety, because there's nothing better than actually seeing that you have this right and your organization can see this. So we call them the policy of resistance. So we have menstruation flexibility, we have menstruation leave. Every month they get a day off for any person that menstruates. We have parental leave. These are terminologies that are extremely important. We have adoption leave in general. We have emergency leave. And then we have, this is somewhat of a distribution of wealth, where we also share our days off. So if someone has an abundance of days and doesn't know what to do with them, or that's usually my case, I never end up using any of my annual leave, I can share them with my staff. So the whole team could then go off and use the days that we have remaining and get to enjoy it together. So these are like little things that are extremely important. And the fact that our organization is comprised of everyone that it aims to serve. So if you are not a member, if you are not of the community we aim to serve, why are you here? And if we are not of that community, why are we serving it? How are we best equipped to do so? And to make sure these networks are all feeding into each other. On a note of hope, I think my note of hope is that this global understanding of all of us seeing the links and the intersectionality of our oppression, and exactly as we said, that we actually have more power over funding bodies than they have over us when it comes down to it. They do need our profile, they do need to spend this, they do need that. But when we collectively as organizations and grassroots and community builders are the ones setting what we need, what is our context, what is the funding body supposed to be doing? You're here to serve us, and vice versa, we serve our community. So then the hierarchy drops downwards. And this is, I think, something that we can always reimagine constantly. My hope is that we understand that we have a lot more in common than we do that separates us when it comes to the oppressive facets and who's actually benefiting as opposed to who's losing, whether it be rights or space or safety or access or any of the different variables that are used to oppress. Because it's all a form of violence, but it's just so layered and it ricochets so quickly that we sometimes feel like if we fix this hole, like it's going to seal the entire wall. And that's usually not it. Another thing is aside from the policy of resistance funding bodies, I think is us understanding that we have more power than media now to disseminate information. And that's something that is extremely beautiful to see reaching information. Yeah, I don't follow any media outlets, I follow activists. I don't follow any, big journalist, that's funded by CNN. I follow grassroots activists, direct action people. Like I'm there with them climbing on that statue and pole. Like that's where I want to be. I don't want to be with the person that comes in after the fact and films it and says, look what they've done. Because that's just the mouthpiece of the state. And in my opinion, there is no such thing as a state for the people. It hasn't been the case. They haven't shown it, they haven't proven it. So until I actually see a case in which the state works for the people, I'm not going to believe that it exists.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you. Emilia, would you like to continue?
Sí, yes. Creo que lo que dice Dana va muy como en el camino de lo que yo pensé cuando nos mandaste esta pregunta, y es, yo siempre cuando que me preguntan esto me apego un poco como a Donna Haraway y su concepto de worlding, y cómo al pensar este mundo nuevo estamos creando este mundo, estos otros mundos posibles, ¿no? Y me parece muy bello ver como todo lo que dice Dana sobre estas políticas, por ejemplo, de trabajo justo, que muchas veces se establecen en los espacios del activismo, que muchas veces se establecen y no solo en el trabajo, ¿no? Estos grupos de cuidado, estos grupos con éticas feministas, estos grupos con éticas disidentes, ya existen. Y yo creo que eso es algo que tenemos que tener en cuenta. Estos otros, es decir, el mundo está plagado de mundos posibles que ya existen, que ya se han creado y que están funcionando. Hay comunidades de cuidado, hay comunidades de colectividad. Y yo creo que esto es un poco como lo que, digamos, esperanzador de lo que yo siempre me cojo un poco cuando uno está trabajando con tantos temas de violencia, con tantos temas de injusticia, es un poco como recordar, bueno, pero incluso cuando la gente está trabajando con esto, lo hace muchas veces creando espacios distintos y creando mundos más justos en el hacer, ¿no? En el hacer de cuestionar, en el hacer de pensarse. Entonces, pues creo que lo que dice Dana es un ejemplo maravilloso de esto. Y que seguramente hay otros mil, incluso entre las personas que estamos en este foro.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lydia. Victor, what is your hope?
I was also about to say communities of care, and I think I aligned very well with both Dana and Amelia on the way in terms of what gives me hope. I think there is because I've mentioned authoritarianism in the beginning of my presentation. I feel like some parts of it would be, what is the cure for authoritarianism, and not just right-wing authoritarianism, but authoritarianism, it can be libertarian too. There's like a lot of different ways how this moves together, and some leftist politics have also been, and I think there's a way for, and I love the concept of imagination that we brought in together, because I think this is about not staying within the defined rules of post-French Revolution theory of left, right, and center, because it also draws from colonialism. I think in the communities of care conversation and the way to move forward, I often look into strategies coming from the global South, particularly around structuring not just structuring the work, but also thinking about the way we exist as a society, or societies as a collection of societies. I think about decentralization, disconnect from national governments, disconnect from state governments, thinking about existing beyond borders, existing beyond the violence of creating borders, and not allowing different kinds of transgressions. I think there is a lot of violence in the world that's systemic and state-based, and with creating communities of care, but also creating a care economy, creating an understanding of the not only individual but also collective health as the most prominent part of our society. I think that's one of the things that I'm looking forward to. I'm not even hopeful, I'm looking forward to them, because I know they're coming. I know that in a world where we are overworked, burned out in activism, but also in other spaces where many people hate their jobs because they do jobs that are not creative, not inspiring, and do not bring anything. Very often people have jobs but are still live in poverty. I think the existence of poverty is something that we need to think about in our in the way we want to reimagine work. Why is there poverty? How do we redistribute? Because we have enough resources to end many of the things that are plaguing our world today. It's just about reimagining, supply, reimagining the way things are redistributed, and also thinking about first and foremost others and then ourselves. I think that's one of the things. My individual health is important to me, but in my individual health, I also want my community to be healthy. I want my friends to be healthy. I want my family to be healthy, but I also want everybody around me to be healthy, because we depend on each other. And I think it's about as much as care as it is about the acceptance that dependence is something that we have in society, and that dependence comes from so many different dimensions, that if we don't put all of ourselves on the front in terms of care, we all lose in a way. I think that's and like I said, I'm not hopeful. I'm looking forward to it, because I see it emerging, and I honestly think that because of the especially in the Western world, in the global North, I think the COVID-19 pandemic, it brought a realization around how ineffective our systems are in terms of care. How what we thought was great healthcare systems crumble because of one issue, right? And I think that is going to bring us, hopefully, that is the hope that I'm bringing, to reimagine this and thinking about how we can accommodate everybody rather than just the privilege, or rather than just the few. Yeah, that would be.
Okay. Thank you, Victor. Thank you all three. I think what you have all mentioned in terms of teamwork, concept of imagination, community of care, care economy, collective health, and what you said at the end, Victor, I think it's so important. We depend on each other. In terms of not only global solidarity, but we as a community, all of us, we depend on each other. We cannot go through this alone. And I think that's why I was extremely happy when he said this webinar will take place. And I think since the time is already over, I think it's a testament that we need more of these kind of webinars where we can exchange thoughts, ideas, strategies, and where we can communicate with each other. So thank you so much for taking the time to the three of you. I know for Victor and me, it was really early in the morning, so thank you for getting up so early, for joining us today. Thank you to the audience. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your questions. I wish you all a very good day, and let's stay strong together and active together. Take care.
Thank you for
Bye-bye.
having us. Bye-bye.